welcome back to our third unit. This is on the bones of the skull. Like on the body, the head and neck unit, which is probably the toughest because there's so many structures to know in such a little area. The skull's no different. We'll be going through quite a few structures, and so just bear with me, and if you need to always pause and rewind, you can do that too. So, in trying to find a logical way to approach the skull, I figure we're going to start by checking out the landmarks that are on the outside of the cranial vault, and then we'll go in and see what's underneath too, from a posterior view. So, let's get started here. If we want to start most inferiorly, let's start with the mandible. What we can see looking in an anterior view is the mandible is obviously separate from the skull. The first thing we can see are these foramen on either side. And I can stick my probe right there. And those are called the mental foramen. And that's where the mental nerve will actually come out, right at the chin. So mental obviously referring to your chin. Then if we continue along the body of the mandible, we'll find that we see what's called the angle of the mandible right here, where the body then becomes the ramus. So looking at the ramus, we have a few more structures, landmarks. The first that's most anteriorly, and we can see if I open the jaw, is right here, and that's called the coronoid process of the mandible. If we go posterior to the coronoid process, we go into this little dip, which is the mandibular notch. And then we go back up the dip to the condylar process, right here, which has the head of the mandible and the neck of the mandible. So, if we want to look real fast also, the condylar process, I'm going to switch to a different skull that has the mandible removed. The condylar process will articulate right here in the mandibular fossa. So that's where we can switch back, and you can see where it's moving when you're opening and closing your jaw. That's where it's staying. So that's the outside portion of the mandible, and we'll continue moving up. We have this bone right here where we see our nose that's missing because of all the cartilage. That's called the maxilla, or the maxillary bone. In the maxillary bone, you can see it, I'll stick my probe in there. In the skull, we have a lot of, everything is really bilateral. So we have one right here, and on the left side as well. That's the infraorbital foramen. And there'll be actually a nerve called the infraorbital nerve that exits there. So we have the infraorbital foramen, which is below the orbit. Above the orbit, we have the supraorbital foramen. And the aptly named supraorbital nerve comes out of there. So we have the maxillary bone. We have our nasal bone right here, which is the bridge of your nose. And then we have the frontal bone. So if we want to actually, we'll move looking laterally. The frontal bone will connect to your cheekbone, which is called the zygomatic bone. Now the zygomatic bone, there's actually something interesting about the three bones that interact with it, which are the frontal bone right here, the maxillary bone, and the temporal bone. So they each have a zygomatic process, meaning that's the part of the bone that joins up with the zygomatic bone. So right here would be your zygomatic process of the maxilla. Right here is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. And then right here would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone itself make up the zygomatic arch, or your cheekbone. So if we want to actually look now posteriorly, we see a few more structures. The first, which would be the external occipital protuberance, or that's the knot in the back of your head that you can feel. So it's pretty prominent. And emanating from there, we see the superior nuchal line, and that's where your nuchal ligaments, the back of the neck, will attach to the back of the skull on the occipital bone. So that's just an overview of the outside of this main part of the bones of the face and the skull. All right, so again, we're looking laterally now. We're going to identify a few more bones of the cranial vault, including some of their unique features, or unique feature in this case. So what we can see right here, if you can see where my probe is tracing along this little suture, and that separates the temporal bone, which you can see right here, from the parietal bone, which is up here. Okay. Then the parietal bone will be separated from the frontal bone by this suture, which we'll get a better look at when we look at the skull cap, or the Calvaria, and that is the coronal suture. And then separating all of those between the suture and the coronal suture, we can kind of see where my probe is. I'll bend our friend down here a little bit. But this is part of the sphenoid bone. So where we see this area, this region that I will be circling with my probe, the region where the temporal bone, parietal bone, frontal bone, sphenoid bone all meet is called the pterion. So that's an interesting little feature. Now we'll move our friend out of the way. And we'll look back here. So basically, we just took the skull cap off. And the skull cap, as we mentioned earlier, is known as the Calvaria. So it's made up of what we can see is our frontal bone, our two parietal bones, and then a little wee bit of the occipital bone. So the dividing lines between all these, as we could call them that, is the coronal suture, which runs in a coronal plane, coronal fashion, you can imagine. Separates the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. And then we have our sagittal suture, which runs sagittally down the midline. So imagine like a sagittal cut. That's what this would be referred to as. Where the sagittal suture and the coronal suture meet, right here, is called the bregma. It's an anatomical feature. As we continue the sagittal suture on down, I'll flip around looking posteriorly, we have the lambdoid suture. It's called that because it kind of looks like the Greek lambda. And so where the lambdoid suture and the sagittal suture meet, we have what's called the lambdoid. So lambdoid bregma. And then of course on the side of the skull, looking laterally, the pterion. So we're going to look at the Calvaria again before we head into the skull. And what we can kind of see here, first off, if we look laterally, and hopefully the camera can get this, but you can see these grooves, these little indentations in the bone. And that's kind of where my probe is tracing, right there. And these are called the grooves for the middle meningeal vessels. These are the brain, or the vessels that actually run just under the dura, and if we were to look on the body and the dura surrounding the brain, you actually see these vessels. And so they're really important. They're the vessels that, oftentimes during blunt force, like head trauma, they're the ones that get ruptured and cause the nasty bleeding that you get. And finally, what we want to see is, it's kind of difficult to see on this bone, but where my probe is, there's a groove that's just slightly there. And this runs along the opposite side of the sagittal suture, so it runs along the midline. And this is the groove for the superior sagittal sinus, which is one of the venous sinuses of the dura. And we'll get into that more when we actually get into the cranial vault. So from there, we're going to transition into looking at the cranial vault proper, inside. We're looking inside the skull. We remove the brain. This is what we've got. So I'm going to come along here, and I like to look at this kind of view. This is kind of how I first memorized it, but I just find it helps if you're starting more anteriorly, moving posteriorly. So what we have here is there's basically essentially 3 shelves to the cranial walls. This first shelf, uppermost portion, is called the anterior cranial fossa. This contains, we can see it here, I'll show you on the stylized model, but right here where my probe is, it's called the ethmoid bone. And as you can see, this one has got cracked through. It's very fragile, very thin. So when we look at it, we see this kind of spine sticking up. And I'll move so you can kind of see it sticking up there. That's called the crista galli. And that just runs down the middle of the ethmoid bone. It actually runs down the middle of called the cribriform plate. That's the part that's been all poked out. And I can show you on our stylized model here. There's the cribriform plate. Now it's got a bunch of little foramina in there. And these are called the cribriform foramina. These are where the bulbs of the olfactory nerve, or the cranial nerve 1, first cranial nerve, will actually enter and pierce through to the skull and into this basal cavity. So that's kind of important, but you can see it better on this model. Also better on this model that we can see, and we'll just continue on down, is we see these foramen, my probe's going through. And this is called the optic canal. That's where cranial nerve 2, where your optic nerve will go through. And if we actually look anteriorly, you can see my probe. You can see my probe sticking out through the eye socket. And so that's just a nice way of checking, not only there, but as we'll see in all these other foramen, you can check by putting your probe through the foramen and seeing where it goes. And that's always very helpful in double checking yourself. So the optic nerve will go through here. So now we're going to be looking at some of the foramen in the middle cranial fossa. These are all part of the sphenoid bone. So in this model it's kind of cracked, but this is where it's called the superior orbital fissure. It's on both sides here. And we can also see, if we look anteriorly, I'll stick my probe through there, and we can see, right here, that's where it comes out. Superior orbital fissure. Where my probe's pointing there is the inferior orbital fissure. So superior orbital fissure. Now, several cranial nerves actually go through there. Now we're on the third cranial nerve, the oculomotor nerve, and that gives motor innervation to most of the muscles that control eye movement. We also have cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, which is a cool little nerve because it's a cranial nerve and it just does one job, which is to provide motor innervation and control to a single orbital muscle. We also have the first division of the trigeminal, or the V1 division of the trigeminal, which is called the ophthalmic nerve, the ophthalmic division. And finally we have the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducens or the abducent nerve, either or. So moving on from there, we'll move on down, and you can see it right here where my probe is. It's this little dark spot. It's a very tiny foramen, right here also. And that's called the foramen rotundum. And a division of the trigeminal, the V2 or maxillary division, will run through there. And then our next foramen, right out here, just moved a bit lateral on the sphenoid bone, is called the foramen ovale. And the foramen ovale has one other cranial nerve that goes through it, which is the V3 division, or the maxillary, or the mandibular division of the trigeminal. Maxillary being foramen rotundum, V2. An interesting little side note, the V3, V2, V1 all originate from the trigeminal ganglion, which in the body will actually sit right about here. And you can actually see it as it gives off its nerve V1 to the superior orbital fissure, V2 the foramen rotundum, V3 to foramen ovale. A way for me to just remember what V1, V2, V3 correlate to, I think of, we'll look anteriorly here. I think, okay, 1, 2, 3. Maybe 1, 2, 3 we go from top to bottom. V1 is ophthalmic, and so that's going to be starting at the topmost portion. Ophthalmic meaning eye. V2, okay, it's the middle, maxillary. Oh, that's kind of the middle bone here. And then V3, mandibular division, which will be the lowest part. And they each provide certain innervations to the face in that regard. So it's pretty important, along with the facial nerve in that respect. So back to looking in the cranial vault. We will finish up our foramen in the sphenoid bone. I'll tilt up here, and you can see where my probe is going through. These two. It's called the foramen lacerum. And there are actually no cranial nerves that go through there. So that's the sphenoid bone. Where those foramen are, we have the greater wing of the sphenoid bone right here, and then up into the lesser wing, which is kind of broken off. I'm actually going to flip to my other model, the fake stylized one, where on that lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, we can see where our optic canal was. There's a little process that overlaps that, and that's called the anterior clinoid process. Moving on from the anterior clinoid process, we have a cool little feature, and this is called the Sella turcica, or literally the Turkish saddle. I think of it as like riding a camel or something, where you have this high back. It's kind of a high back seat, which is called the dorsum sellae, the back of the saddle, which we can kind of see also at an angle. You can see how high that really is. And then where that little valley or that little dip is right here, it's called the hypophyseal fossa. So it's a fossa, it's a space where the hypophysis sits. And the hypophysis is the formal name for the pituitary gland. So it's a very fragile structure. It kind of sits in this little pocket of skull. Any kind of pituitary tumor, as you're probably aware of, the surgeons have to go through an incision in the palate and the mouth to get up there and break through. So it's a pretty cool procedure. So moving on from there, before we move on fully, I'm going to move to our next model. And this one, it might be hard to see on the camera. Hopefully you can see it at this angle. Where we had our foramen ovale right here, we had our foramen lacerum. You can kind of see this little indentation, this little dark spot right here. I'm going to stick my probe in there, if it'll let me. And you can see, oh, it goes back. And actually, maybe we can see it. You can kind of see it right there. It's poking out. This is the carotid canal. And looking from a posterior side, we have our external opening for the carotid canal. And then back right here, we have our internal opening for the carotid canal. So there's two openings, internal, external. External is on that posterior base. And the carotid canal is actually the internal carotid artery will run through there. We can see it on this side and on that side. It's very important. The internal carotid artery gives all the blood supply to the brain. It'll loop around in here like, to no rhyme or reason. It's kind of crazy. But moving on from there, we'll actually go from the middle cranial fossa down to the posterior cranial fossa. And for this, we'll flip around and look posteriorly. I think you can see this. We have this big foramen right here, on both sides. And that is the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen has several cranial nerves that go through it, the exit. You have the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. The vagus nerve, it's an important one, cranial nerve 10. and cranial nerve 11, or the spinal accessory nerve. We also have two different venous sinuses that will drain: the inferior petrosal sinus and the sigmoid sinus. And we'll go over those and their grooves in a second. But I missed something. I'm going to flip back real quick. I'll flip back over here. See if we can't see this. Right here. Okay. Sorry, this skull thing is hard to get a right angle, but we can kind of see it right here. I'm going to flip it over again as well. Maybe we can see it better from here. So, where my probe is, it's a little dark spot. It doesn't go through all the way. It's very, very small. Right on this ridge, on the opposite side of the carotid canal, is the internal opening for the acoustic meatus, or the internal opening of the acoustic meatus. This is important. This is where cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, will exit the skull, and they will do some crazy stuff, splitting once you get outside there, that we can talk about in a bit. But that's an important structure to be aware of, the internal opening of the acoustic meatus. And then our last foramen, which almost doesn't seem like a foramen because it's huge, is the foramen magnum. Obviously magnum, it's gigantic. This is where the medulla will actually sit and where your spinal cord comes up from. Right next to it is, there's another little foramen. We can try and see it here. You're good. Is right here, and that's going to be, I'll move my probe. I can't stick my probe through it, but it's right there. It's on this side as well. It's tiny. It's called the hypoglossal canal, and that's where your final cranial nerve 12, will exit. So we'll finish up with our look at the cranial vault with a look at our sinus grooves. So what we can see kind of right here on the anterior part, on the frontal bone, and then also posteriorly on the occipital bone, is the superior sagittal sinus groove, which, if you remember, will come around in that Calvaria, and it loops through here like this. And you can look from this kind of view, we'll go all the way around. So it runs over the top of the cerebrum. I'll look at it this way also. We can look at it from both angles. The superior sagittal sinus will come down and it splits. You can see these indentations right around here, especially right here. This is the groove for the superiors, or the transverse sinus. If we can, you can look at this angle too. Transverse sinus grooves. We'll look at this view. So as we follow the transverse sinus around, you can see if you follow this little lip right here, and then it ducks down. It kind of makes a little S-curve to the jugular foramen. An S-curve or a sigmoid curve means that this is the groove for the sigmoid sinus. Just like we have the S-shaped part of the colon, the sigmoid colon, this will drop down and empty into the jugular foramen. On the other side, we see this groove that you can get a good look at. Again, both sides. This will run down, empty into the jugular foramen. That is the inferior petrosal sinus. So on this side, transverse to sigmoid, inferior petrosal. And then finally, we look at this groove on top of that little ridge on the middle cranial fossa. Right along here is the superior petrosal sinus. Now the sinuses provide, how the veins will drain certain body parts, body areas of blood. The sinuses, the venous sinuses is what they're called, do the same thing. They drain this region of blood and return it to the jugular foramen back into your, which obviously will drain into your jugular veins. And let's see. Now let's look at the posterior view of the skull. This is just to, we can see if you happen to get tripped out on a test or something, also just for general knowledge of if you're looking at the skull base from this angle, what we can happen to see. Again, we have our foramen magnum. Right here would be our hypoglossal canal, where that hypoglossal nerve emanates from. Right here are condyles. They're occipital condyles, and if you remember, they actually articulate with the C1 vertebra or the atlas bone. Now, for some of this, I'm going to cheat, and I like to take a probe and kind of stick it through the top. So, say for example, we're looking at this foramen. Oh, well, that's the foramen ovale. You know, that's a way I like to do it, is if I'm on a test or something and they've tagged something, I'll take my probe, kind of push it through, flip it to where I know when it's coming out, and you can see foramen ovale. And you can just do that with some of these several other ones. And let's see, I'm actually going to jump over to this skull that has the mandible removed for those last few parts of the skull base. So again, we can see our foramen, our various foramen coming out. Now, right here, and this is again kind of stylized, but this is the external acoustic meatus. Remember, we had our internal acoustic meatus. You can kind of see it in both of them here. Sorry. External acoustic meatus, if you were to stick your probe through there, you had a small enough probe, it would come out right there. Internal acoustic meatus. Ta-da. And you can kind of see it right here, but I'll go to the other bone for this. Get this little process that's sticking out. Yeah, this is called the styloid process. And we can kind of see it right here. There's a little foramen behind it that I'll stick my point of my probe in. I'll try to. And that's called the styloid-mastoid foramen. And that's where the 7th cranial nerve will exit, the facial nerve. So styloid process. Again, we already checked out the mandibular fossa, where the head of the mandible, or the condylar process of the mandible will sit. If we want to look at here, this part of the sphenoid bone, we have the lateral pterygoid plate. This is on both sides, lateral pterygoid plate, right there. If we want to look at this angle, we can see it even better. We have our lateral pterygoid plate and our medial pterygoid plate. So lateral, medial pterygoid plate. The medial pterygoid plate will come up, and we have another little process, and that is called the pterygoid hamulus. So it's just useful to know. All right, that takes care of most of the skull. We'll finish off where we started at the mandible, and where we went through the anterior and lateral portion of the mandible. We'll finish off looking at the internal portion. So you can kind of see it in this guy, but right here, and you can even feel it on a lot of these, is the genial tubercles, or are the genial tubercles, also called the mental spines of the mandible. They're right in that middle portion, that midline. If we're going to go laterally, we see this line right here. You can kind of feel that ridge, you can see that ridge. It's on both surfaces. That's called the mylohyoid line. That's where the mylohyoid muscle will actually attach right along here. Then we'll finally look right here where this spring is. You can see this foramen, another foramen, and this is the last one we'll look at today, and that is called the mandibular foramen. And that'll actually go into the mandible and exits the mental foramen. They're connected. That is the skull, and again, like before, if you have any questions, feel free to ask your TA, professors, go through the self-check quizzes, and always feel free to use this whenever you'd like. Thanks.
After midnight, we're gonna let it all hang down. gonna stimulate some action. We gonna get some satisfaction.